Welcome to the Cognitive Crucible, produced by the Information Professionals Association. Our website is information-professionals.org, where you can find links and information about today's conversation and get access to members-only content. Join John Bicknell and explore all aspects of our generational challenge, cognitive security. The Cognitive Crucible is a forum that presents different perspectives and emerging thought leadership related to the information environment. The opinions expressed by guests are their own and do not necessarily reflect the views of or endorsement by the Information Professionals Association.
We have three guests today on the Cognitive Crucible. First is Dave Pitts, who is a senior national security professional, former CIA executive, and veteran with over 4 decades of experience in challenging and critical missions, ranging from intelligence operations, counterterrorism, and special operations to great power competition. Hey, Dave, welcome to the Cognitive Crucible.
Hey, good morning. Great to be here. And sorry you had to get up so early to do this. I've looked at a lot of the stuff you're doing on Cognitive Crucible, and you've had some real experts here. So it's quite an honor to be here, and certainly an honor to be here with my two esteemed colleagues.
All right. Well, welcome to you, Dave, and looking forward to it. And this is a labor of love, so I certainly don't mind getting up. Next, would like to introduce Joe Miller, who is the Deputy Commander for Support for the U.S. Army Special Operations Command, and formerly Joe was the J5 at Special Operations Command. So, Joe, welcome.
Hey, thanks. Really glad to be here. Thank you very much for inviting us, and looking forward to probably a pretty interesting conversation. Thank you.
Yep, and absolutely, Joe. And last is Austin Branch, who is one of the founding members of the Information Professionals Association, and he also founded Crescent Bridge to help serve the information, technical, and cognitive needs of the federal government. Austin, welcome back.
Thanks, John.
And
thanks for having us, and look forward to the conversation.
Yeah, Austin, I think this is your third time on the podcast, so a couple more appearances and you get the gold jacket.
I'll remind myself of that next opportunity. Thanks, John.
All right, yeah. So, gentlemen, the conversation I'd like to have with you today will cover a very important combination of topics, but cognitive warfare and the gray zone. But before we get into this, could one of you please sketch out the way you see our strategic landscape currently?
Well, this is Joe. I'll take a shot at that. So I think his perspective is really important to think about where we are, and I'll just take a couple minutes to talk about that. Our current national security structure, as we have it, is really rooted back. I'd go back to like 47, 48, and literally the National Security Act back then, when we began to divide ourselves up. We had a professional intelligence community. We separated out. We began to talk about how we were doing. We then formed ourselves in this idea of a competition between two large views of the world, right? Kind of the Russian autocratic view of the world, the communist view of the world, our free market capitalism, our great experiment that came out of World War II. As we progressed through Vietnam, we saw those kind of competitions that we continue to do around the world. And then about, like you can say, in the early 90s, my experience when the Army recovered from its post-Vietnam malaise, spent a lot of time training itself to be completely different, to be dominant in large conventional warfare. At that point in time, we ended up going to Desert Storm, and we proved the idea of how good a large army could be against another large army. That arguably cued two of our great competitors, the Chinese and the Russians, to ask, wow, what happened with the United States Army, and how good did the United States Army and the United States military become in this period of the 80s post-Vietnam? At that point in time, you saw the Chinese publish a book was called, Unrestricted Warfare. And basically they said, how do I begin to deal with a technologically superior enemy that is far, far more capable than I am? And how do I begin to think about how I do things? And you saw the Russians begin to do some thinking about that too. And then at that point, again, the contextual part is, that's when Francis Fukuyama's book came up, The End of History, it's all going to be good. The liberal democracies are going to rise, and the world will all be friendly, and we can all start to put down our weapons. We saw again the peace dividend in the late 90s, the reduction in those kinds of things, and then 2001 hits, and now we have another set of problems which are unlike the problems that we had before. Like we always do, we rapidly adapted to do that. We adapted the ground forces, the air forces, the intelligence community. We rapidly rotated into this idea of networks and how we get after networks and how we scale ourselves to do those kinds of things. Well, you can argue that while we were engaged with that period of time, both our primary opponents were thinking, okay, I have time right now to rethink how I'm going to get ready to do things. And I have time to think about what I'm going to do relative to the United States. And arguably the things that came out of the realization, there's all kinds of things that, three wars theories, the Russian, doctrine of escalation, all those different kinds of things that started to come out. But now what we've seen is over this time, while we've been busy, is a whole set of tools have been developed. And this idea of where we're working in the cognitive space and the erosion of the very underpinnings of the things that allow us to do business in the world have been taken on. And you saw that all the way through the Russian troll farms, Chinese third PLA, all the kinds of things that are happening, intellectual property being stolen, all those kinds of things that allow our opponents to fight. It's the old win without fighting. And so I think fundamentally that's where we have come to this point now that we're now having to do battle in a space which is far less kinetic, but far more important because it erodes the fundamental underpinnings of what we are as a society and what we are as a society, a collection of free nations. And those are the kinds of things that we're going to have to take a really, really hard look at and understand that the tools that we require are going to be different because what's happening is the sand is being eroded from underneath our feet and the things that establish our ability to do things and work well together, not just as a nation, but work well together with other nations so that we're able to put those things together and be able to do the kinds of things to protect our ways of life. So it is a different place, same actors, different game. And they've now had 20 years to get ready for a different game. And we're coming out of a game just a few years ago and we're reorienting. So I think that's kind of the strategic landscape if I was going to do that very quickly.
I think it adds a whole new view on our security architecture. I mean, we've been traditionally focused on physical security, cybersecurity, all these other aspects that protect the institutions and the things that Joe just talked about. But now we also have to think about cognitive security as part of the 21st century security architecture that we have to pay great attention to, because as Joe already pointed out, our adversaries have prioritized maneuver and competition in the cognitive and information environment to gain their advantage. They realize that that's where we're vulnerable and where our seams are, and they've elected and prioritized their resources and approach to compete and to diminish and as Joe said, is to kind of blow the sand away from under our feet as we're focused in other areas. But Dave Pitts, you've written extensively on this. Any thoughts to complement Joe's?
No, I think Joe laid that out very well. Thanks for that, Joe. I think the points that I would just add to that, it just really highlights that great power competition is intensifying, but it's intensifying at a time when great powers don't want to go to direct conflict against each other, and they still have to have options. And I think as we talk through this, we'll see this is where the gray zone and cognitive warfare play even a more significant role today than before.
Yeah, well, that leads us right into, one of the, title topic areas of cognitive warfare. Could one of you give a working definition of cognitive warfare? This is and also is this the kind of term that you ask 10 different experts, you get 10 different, slightly different definitions?
Yeah, let me take a shot at that. And I think the answer to that is yes. And I think when you look at cognitive warfare and the evolving nature of cognitive warfare, I would be cautious in trying to be too prescriptive in a definition that limits our thinking on the evolution of cognitive warfare. And I do think it's okay if there's some variations in the operating definitions we have, because it is very much an evolving state, and we should let it evolve, but we should try to let our language evolve with it as well. And so I bet for all the people who will hear this, they all have their own definitions of cognitive warfare. So I'll just throw out a brief one. And I think and I think what's important is to differentiate cognitive warfare from the many other terms that are in play. And you guys know this, there's many terms that we use in this information space and influence space. Some of them are complementary, some probably contradict each other. But I think these are activities across a broad spectrum to achieve our adversaries' very strategic objectives against us or some other nation. But they do this by influencing individuals, groups, and societies at the cognitive level. So this is where it starts to look different from some of the things in the past. But that is through some traditional information and influence operations that we've seen for years, but also through, I think now, increasingly a wide range of actions and pressures that influence cognition. Sort of intimidation as influence is used to a greater extent today, sometimes more subtly, sometimes more direct, but it plays a role. And what this means is, from a cognitive perspective, is what and how we think, how we make decisions, the decisions we make, and even our will and resolve are under assault through cognitive warfare by our adversaries. And if you think about this, I would just say cognitive warfare is a comprehensive assault on human cognition that extends well beyond just the spread of false information that we've seen for years from our adversaries. So I'll just throw that out there as a starting point for a definition.
Right. And I mentioned this occasionally, or refer back to this occasionally on the podcast. Way back up at the top of the podcast, we had John Davis, and like episode number 13, and all of y'all know John, I'm sure. But anyway, he mentions that whenever there, in his experience at least, definitional squabbles around terms like this, he calls term warfare. And more often than not, again in his experience, the squabble winds up being important for who has claim to a certain pot of money. So it all maps back to money somehow. I'm not sure whether that is something that resonates with any of you. But
I was going to wait, John. Let me jump
yeah,
in on that.
yeah.
And John Davis is exactly right. And we've all talked about this. We sadly, especially with regard to this broad mission set that we're talking about, for years it's been, and I'll say it, there's been more emphasis on filling sandbags around each respective equity than there has been orientation on the threat, common orientation on the threat. And that's been all around how do you frame a capability or an approach that has a resource aligned to it, and then who's in charge. We have been for at least 2.5 decades, maybe almost three, in this mission space specifically. That has been our handicap, and where we have where our all well-meaning organizations, institutions, and individuals, but really focus on the way what do I think about it? How do I express it? What's mine? How do I resource it? How do I maneuver and get the resources to have some primacy? And that has really distracted us from really orienting all of our efforts toward the threat that both Joe and Dave were talking about. And the other piece of this, before we move on, is that we've also come to recognize that government alone is not our security apparatus is not the only victim here. It's the entirety of our societies, and this is an all-in proposition. So the ability of not only our government, but our government's relationship and work with the private sector and all the other communities of interest who are also being challenged, and how we're commonly oriented to advantage to try and seek advantage for our nation, and that includes our businesses, our economies, our culture, our way of life. And it's hard for folks to put their heads around, but government alone will not succeed.
Yeah, I want to kind of go back to what Dave was saying too. I think when we talk about cognition, right? So if you talk about cognition, let's go back to like it's important to get your terms straight, right? Because we're talking about how you acquire information and how you understand through thought, action, and in the environment. So that's what cognition is about, right? So, and it's about through your senses and through your system. So if you look at what your opponent is doing, they're affecting the way you acquire information, and they're affecting the way you process and understand information to change that as you go through time. And if you're not aware of that, you are being turned very quickly. And I think part of that discussion is to understand, the basic underpinnings of the friction that they're trying to create inside of our system, because they seek to do that in the cognitive warfare. That's the idea, is the induction of friction, inducing friction into your system that doesn't allow your system to work as fast, that then gives them positional advantage, either in your head, either in the head between the two of you, or gives them time to gain positional advantage on the ground. And so it is a form of maneuver, because maneuver is all about advantage. And we've traditionally thought of maneuver as advantage to a piece of ground or a piece of terrain that gives you that ability to control a fight. So until we understand that there is maneuver in this cognitive space, it's going to be very difficult for us to catch up, because you can't have enough guns to overwhelm that. You can be completely aced out very quickly. So that's why I think this is so important for us to wrap our heads around it.
Yeah, yeah, okay, 100%. Well, so
Just add to that.
Dave, it sounded like you're tagging on there.
Yeah, sorry, I just wanted
Yeah,
to,
yeah.
I really appreciate that point. Sometimes I've referred to this as the battle for knowledge. I mean, that's a conversation we can have some other time. But what I mean by that is, look, we all make consequential decisions every day based on what we know, or based on what we think we know. And so when you think about, and by the way, know and believe, and I think the belief part really gets sort of into this cognitive space. And so when our adversaries can replace what we know and what we believe with the information they want us to think we know and believe, then that means we are not making the decisions we think we're making. And so that's us as voters and investors, but it's also policymakers, it's military leaders, it's the heads of industry. So this is a consequential issue that if we're not paying attention to, we're going through our decision-making processes, but we have the wrong information, we have the wrong beliefs, we have the wrong realities in our mind, and that could be a powerful detriment.
Yeah.
And as Joe said, those not everything happens naturally here. Some of it is obviously well engineered and forecasted by our adversaries and I'll double down on the word maneuver, to maneuver and position to gain advantage in this space. And God forbid, and then we start introducing the technologies that really allow maneuver to happen much more quickly and in ways that we've even yet to even fathom the possibilities. But so anyway, back over to you, John.
Sure, sure. Well, I think that probably leads into, getting on the table a working definition of what is meant by the gray zone. Could one of you sketch that out, please?
Yeah, I'll jump on that just because it's so connected to what I was just talking about. And by the way, I think when we add put this piece on the table, then sort of that great power competition or that strategic landscape, the gray zone and cognitive warfare, we see that intimate and important connection with those. So a definition I might use for the gray zone is the geopolitical space between peace and war, where nations can advance their national interest and attack the national interest and undermine the global credibility and reputation of other countries. So in this case, let's say us, right? Our adversaries can do that against us, but without triggering a military response. So if you think about it, it means China, Russia can conduct activities against us to advance their national interest and limit and hinder and undermine our national interest without triggering a military response. But they could also use those activities to set the conditions for a future war. And there's some examples of that we can talk about. So that's probably the sort of the most basic definition of the gray zone. And you can think about the activities that Russia is doing against us and our European allies, what China is doing against us, and our global allies to advance their national interests. So let me just throw that out as a starter, and I'm certainly sure there's more we can talk about.
Yeah, for sure. Well, um, uh, uh, I think where you guys wanted to go with this discussion is to try to, bring together these two working definitions of cognitive warfare and the gray zone, and productively talk about how we can, set the conditions for information advantage. How would you, you know, start bringing that into the discussion?
Hey,
So,
and before my colleagues jump in, if you gentlemen will just let me add one more point to this. And so this is how I would walk this down, so it's all connected. And Joe talked about this already, and Austin and I added to it as well. First is great power competition is intensifying, right? Then great powers will go to great lengths to avoid direct competition or direct conflict with another great power. I mean, we can look at the lessons from World War II when great militaries were defeated. And you can even look at the damage to Russia's national power, just an indirect conflict. Great powers want to avoid that. There's so many unintended and potentially consequential impacts of great power warfare, and it could take some countries decades to recover from that. So this is where winning without fighting sort of comes in to play. So with those two in place, the third one is this is the gray zone. This is where the gray zone becomes so important. It allows countries to avoid that conflict, but still advance their national interest and still take actions against us. And as great power competition intensifies, then the gray zone starts to expand. And because it's so difficult to respond in the gray zone really effectively, we should expect our adversaries to do more and more things in the gray zone. And so the gray zone is a place where great power competition is taking shape today. And I think the most prevalent and maybe most effective gray zone activity is cognitive warfare. And I think that it just briefly sort of connects these in an important way.
yeah, this is Joe. I to jump on what Dave was saying. I want to maybe add a little point about what cognitive warfare should be about. I mean, one of I think the most often misused terms that you see thrown around inside of the environment that we're talking about now about warfare and the future warfare is this idea of asymmetry. Everybody says, well, we're going to do something, we're going to do asymmetric, we're going to do something asymmetric. And I go, well, what does that mean? And the problem with that is that what we're talking about, what we should be talking about is, symmetry is really like, oh, I'm asymmetric because I have a missile that's faster than you, a missile that's longer than you, or I can go farther, deeper, better. It's the asymmetry we keep talking about is the asymmetry inside of the physical exchange between two forces. All right. But what we really should be talking about, and this goes into the discussion of what cognitive warfare is, asymmetry should be defined as something that you can do to your opponent for which they are culturally or intellectually or institutionally unprepared for at that point in time. And what do I mean by that? You are operating in a piece of the system that your opponent is not organized for and cannot turn fast enough. And I'll just tell you, one of the things that happened early in the war on terror was the rolling attacks that we did over networks, when we were able to move so fast that they didn't understand it, and then they adapted to the way we were doing business, and it got harder as we went in there. So this idea of asymmetry has to be connected to this idea of cognitive warfare, because what you're trying to do is operate in that cycle so that your opponent is always trying to catch up to you, and you're imposing those dilemmas as you go through. And that is a matter of how understanding how they acquire their cognition, how they take information in, how they learn, and how they use it. And if we don't understand that, then all we're going to do is build bigger things that go farther and faster. And so I think Dave has set the table for a really, really good discussion about that.
Let me offer that this whole idea of and we've used terms in the DoD. We'd use terms like information operations, information warfare, military information support operations, the platforms and mechanisms and tools in the cyberspace and electromagnetic spectrum, military dissent. All these capabilities are critically they're critical pieces of the mosaic of things that need to be organized and commonly oriented for the DoD's contribution to this broader national effort. But fundamental to all of this is having a common appreciation, a common appreciation of what the value proposition, the necessity of understanding and orienting our resources and actions towards the cognitive informational gray zone considerations that were just outlined by Joe and Dave. We got to say, okay, yeah, agree. This is critically important, and our adversaries are here. And yes, we need the ability to align our capabilities, our technology, our efforts in a common direction, and that's fundamental here. This has been said by others, this mission area, the information, has probably been the most overstudied and overanalyzed mission area for the last 2.5 decades. It's almost been a cottage industry. What is this? What's the lexicon? And time is now to take definitive action, organize our resources and activities, establish alignment. I would offer that more critical now than ever is to understand that this is a network of networks. It's at the intersection of shared interest. DoD has a huge contribution to make, but is a contribution to a larger, what should be a larger effort, not just government, but as already pointed out, with multinational corporations, institutions, and others that are also being equally challenged. You don't have to own anything to integrate it, but I'll tell you, it's critically important that we as a country, as a society, have some common orientation, because I would tell you, when you boil all this down, we start to see that our adversaries maneuvering in this space is not just oriented at our military and our governmental institutions. They're actually touching and effectively influencing, our industries, our culture, and frankly, our way of life. And so critical to this is common understanding, common orientation, and at this intersection of shared interest.
Yeah, a frequent theme on the podcast is the necessity or criticality of partners and allies. How would you guys drop that onto this whole discussion space?
Let me take a little shot at that. And if you don't mind, I'm going to zig and zag a little bit because what I wanted to add was this idea about the gray zone, which can also be a bit fuzzy about what it is, and I understand that. If I could just quickly go through, what are adversaries really trying to do against us in the gray zone?
Mm-hmm.
And this is something I wrote about in one of the papers or cipher brief that anybody that's read it. But I think the first thing our adversaries want to do in the gray zone is win the cognitive battle. I mean, this is really important. Again, when you talk about winning without fighting, this cognitive battle sort of, I think, underpins all that. Because our adversaries want to manipulate us, how we see the world, what we think, how we make decisions, the actual decisions we make, hopefully to favor them. They're winning when that is happening. The second thing they want to do is alter the geopolitical landscape to their advantage. And this is one where you might think, well, this is where you may be trying to set conditions for a future war. Russia's grab of Crimea in 2014 is a perfect example of that. Not a shot really fired, and they took over a major piece of real estate on their border, really altering the geopolitical landscape. Tried the same thing in 2022. That one turned out a little bit differently. We'll see what the final call is on that. China's done the same thing with sort of creating these false islands, trying to establish a new status quo around Taiwan. It's doing the same thing around the Philippines, the Second David Shoals, and some of those areas where it's trying to assert its presence in a way that creates new realities, new geopolitical status of existing spaces that are already controlled by other countries. Third, they want to compromise and disrupt our central national systems. This is also one where you might say that's preparations for a future war, but this has also got a powerful cognitive effect. And that is when Russia, China, and Iran penetrate critical infrastructure in America. We know they're there. We know they've done it. They've got some deniability. We can't get them off of our systems. We don't know the full extent to that penetration. That is dangerous for us in a real conflict, or it's dangerous for us also in a great conflict. And not directed so much at us, but to our allies, right? Assassinations and sabotage and other direct actions, which are meant to do some sort of destructive harm, but it's also got a powerful cognitive effect as well. You think about Russia, China, Iran hacking our telecom infrastructure, technology theft, IP theft. These are all things that they can do in the gray zone to gain an advantage. And I would say, finally, what they're trying to do is really undermine us globally. We see Russia was certainly doing this in Syria. Russia does this everywhere. Wherever we are, Russia's going to be there. China's going to be there. In many cases, they're using political coercion, bribery, and other measures to pull countries away from us or insert themselves in the political process in countries so that those countries don't eventually work with the United States, or they won't become a partner with us. China's Belt and Road Initiative is a great enabler of that. So very quickly, I just wanted to mention those 5 things. And I think there's great power here in working with our partners and allies, because in many cases, we're not just a target, it's us and our allies, certainly in the case of Russia and Europe, and certainly in the case of China around Taiwan and the South China Sea. So that's quick, but I just wanted to make sure I got that in there.
Can I make a quick point as you listen to Dave and Joe in this conversation? And there's been many conversations, some Cognitive Crucible points and other folks talking publicly about the importance of this. But a lot of those conversations have been woe is us, the information community, we're losing the information war, we're being outmaneuvered. I don't think the 3 of us are talking about some black cloud that we'll never know. This is no, we as a nation are perfectly capable and have all the resources and the ability to compete and gain advantage in this space. We can do this. And we've seen senior leaders in our military and other places really highlight the importance and the criticality of being able to organize and maneuver in the space. We heard testimony from some of our senior commanders, Admiral Paro, General Fenton, actually highlighting the need, the necessity to have capacity and to be organized to compete and gain advantage in this environment, to align the resources necessary to do so. We have other people speaking and thinking, critical thinking. Admiral Mike Studeman's done some great work in thinking with regard to China in this particular space, and he's written extensively. Obviously, key leaders like Dave, who have been writing in the Cipher Brief and other places. But this is not a time to be sitting there doing a woe is me kind of thing. This is a call to action. We have the capabilities. We still have technological advantage. We have the organizations, agencies, constructs, and we just got to orient it and move out. And I think that's what we're talking about, right? We appreciate, we understand, we have context, we have a framework and a general understanding, but it's a time for action. And again, it's not just government. Government can help inspire it, but this is our opportunity, because if we miss these windows, what it's going to take for us, the investment and the time and to gain some sort of advantage, that distance to success gets greater and greater as our adversaries have placed a great priority and maneuvering in the space today.
One of the discussions that you just talked, about the allies and the ability of working with our partners and those kinds of things, that's what the entire formation that I am a part of, that's what they do. And we think that how you're able to leverage. Again, that's that going back to that idea we talked about. When you're talking about a cognitive warfare, it's like, how do you learn, right? Well, every society is different, how they take in information and those kinds of things. So one of the things that we think is extremely important is to be able to work with your partners and being able to use their expertise to help you understand how things are coming in and resonating in the places they are going, and understand all these secondary and tertiary kind of things that happen. And there's a certain understanding of the dependencies we tend to not look at. We tend to look at as one thing causes another thing, and there's a bunch of dependencies when things start resonating out, when that wave of information goes out as you're going through time. So I think your allies and your partners become extraordinarily important to you. We in our command, we are spending a lot more time looking at this. We'll talk about this idea of irregular warfare, which is essentially wrapped up in the idea of the gray zone, about where you're going. And my boss, John Braga, is all over this, about how are we organizing and how are we getting ourselves ready for the future as we go through this. So it is really important for us to keep those fundamentals of how you work with your allies and your partners, but recognize that what you're going to do with them is going to be different in the future than what we have done before.
And
Right.
Joe and Dave, wouldn't you agree that our allies and partners, which would include, we would include some of the commercial industries
Absolutely.
that are
Yeah.
out there,
Multinational companies. Yeah.
they have, wouldn't you agree that they have access and credibility in areas that we will never have?
Absolutely. And I think they have a cultural knowledge that old German Fingerspitzengefühl thing, right? The touch, right? They have a touch in their places on the earth that we don't have, and we probably never will. So if we don't
Hmm.
able to keep that connection, that ability to rapidly learn, and Dave spent his whole life doing that too.
Yeah,
So
Yeah.
we just had a great discussion. I'll put a link in the show notes with JD Maddox, who I think all of you know JD, but he was bringing up some provocative potential initiatives or reassertion of some things that are even in the Constitution, such as like letters of marque and deputizing or putting out for bid global activities by not non-state actors on behalf of the United States. I mean, if this is an all-in proposition, then presumably those kinds of things are on the table, especially as we were just talking about multinational companies.
Yeah,
I
one
know
thing I
Dave is going to jump in.
The one thing I would add too is, the role of the private sector. Look, about 85% of critical infrastructure in the United States is controlled by the private sector. So they got skin in the game. Think about international banking. Sort of think about, the U.S. global economic power in great part comes from our corporations that are working around the world. And as I think Joe was getting this, the U.S. private sector is expeditionary. It goes places where the rest of us aren't going, right? And sometimes when you show up, you meet your U.S. companies, maybe an energy company that have been working in some dangerous areas for a long time. I also think about IP theft, right? Technology theft. The private sector is almost always the victim of that. So they've incurred some great losses. We don't always hear about it, but they've incurred some great losses with IP theft going to China. And many of our best companies are under constant assault, right, by our foreign adversaries trying to get access to their people, their IP. They're just trying to get inside of their systems. So I would say certainly the private sector, and most of the private sector gets this. By the way, I'd also add, where are AI developments taking place? In the U.S. private sector. We're world leaders. That's because of our partners in the private sector. So they got skin in the game, and I think they have the expertise, the critical thinking, and the capabilities just to be an incredibly pourful partner in what U.S. is doing.
And so, Dave, and to Joe, a question about to you. One of the things that we in government, formerly government, that is, how do you have those very sophisticated conversations with those partners, where we have a deep understanding of where their interests are being challenged, without coming off as, this is the government, here's what we'd like you to do.
Here's your contract here's your contract app.
And so our ability to have the skill, the knowledge, the capability and appreciation for how we interact with the private sector. Now, I'm not talking about the defense industry enterprise. We have those. It's the ones you're talking about, Dave, and our ability to set the conditions for common orientation. I've always talked about the power of convening. Government does have the power to convene, to share information, to maybe drive or inspire common orientation at the intersection of shared interests. But both of your thoughts on how we might improve our ability to, in fact, engage and find that common orientation without trying to command and control, without trying to, tell people what to do.
Yeah, I'll again, having sat on this interface for a while, I know my brother across who was in Langley for a long time. You have to change your policymakers' tolerance for risk, right? To know that you're not going to have a certain outcome. I've told you to do this. I want this done by this point in time. You're going to have much more of a learning mindset in your policy infrastructure if you're going to work with people who have to meet their institutional, whether they're private sector or whatever goals, whether it's profit and growth or whatever those are. You have to understand that they've got to be able to do that too in order to do that. And so it's not like you're going to be able to give these guys direct taskings or anything, but you are this shared interest that you talked about is the idea. How do you define the shared interest, right? And recognize that everybody's got to get something out of it and nobody gets everything. And then the idea is, what are the boundaries? What are the policy boundaries within which you want to operate? And then you got to kind of let go, and you got to be able to tolerate a few mistakes every once in a while instead of assemble the guilty, chop the heads off, fire somebody. This is a time to be much more tolerant of risk and understand that there are tools that exist out there in the commercial sector and knowledges that exist in the commercial sector that we just don't have. And frankly, skills and attributes that we don't have. And not at the scale that they can bring together.
Yeah, well, I mean, back up to the top, for me at least, Joe, that reminds me of what you were describing as to, what our adversaries are doing. At least partially, their agenda is to sow division, which goes right to the very heart of what you were talking about with shared values and setting some kind of a loose but, directionally accurate intent for the blue team and the lovers of democracy and free societies to generally be aligned in the same direction in pursuing those goals, even if it's not, with maybe, some loose joints and a larger risk envelope, but, setting that kind of a conditioned space for everybody to go and pursue their own goals while collaborating as they can.
Yeah, I'm gonna toss this over to Dave for a second, but watching what happened after 9/11, and there's an analog, and I actually have a point here, so let me get to it.
Yeah, yeah.
We started as a very a closed system about how we were sharing things, right? And then we recognized very quickly that we went to Five Eyes sharing, and then we went to Five Eyes Plus, and then we began to bring many more people and many more. We brought more people who were interested in this common problem that we had, and we were able to put together a very, in my opinion, a pretty effective response over time on banging on the networks. But that's against a bunch of a relatively small, smart guys that learn pretty fast. But we were able to contain that. Now when you start talking about dealing with other giant nations with enormous resources, the partners that we have to bring in are not wearing uniforms and they're not parts of governments. You have to. What does that Five Eye kind of relationship look like with your critical partners in industry and things that have those shared values, that the system that they live within, that we have all sworn to protect? How do we bring that together? So I think that's one of the things that I think and that's the Austin shared interest discussion that we have to embrace policy-wise.
Yeah. Well, gentlemen, this is obviously a big, sprawling discussion space and problem space, and we're really just probably hitting the wave tops. So to be continued, obviously. If we could maybe wrap up, I've got a couple of typical wrap up questions. And first would be a suggestion for a research topic that perhaps a command and staff or top level school student might take a crack at in order to help shed some additional light or make some progress in this area.
Yeah, let me just offer one, and I certainly respect the thoughts that my colleagues might have. But we talk about the impact of cognitive warfare, and quite frankly, I think sometimes it's easy to underestimate, but also overestimate. Right? Our adversaries are working against us diligently, but they're not 10 feet tall, and like some of our own operations, everything they do doesn't work. So the question for me would be, showing sort of the cause and effect from Russian cognitive warfare against the United States, sort of against public opinion and decision making, maybe around Ukraine. And I think there's been some discussion, and I've written about it a little bit, that Putin's early use of red lines and saber rattling and nuclear threats, which were most people figured out, hey, maybe those aren't real threats. That's intimidation. That's meant to have a cognitive effect. The question is, did that influence U.S. policy on when certain weapon systems could be delivered to Ukraine, or the restrictions we put on sort of how deep they could use certain weapon systems? And we didn't give them some of the weapons they asked for a really long time. Did cognitive warfare by Russia and reflexive control, which is a term Russia often used, does that have an impact on that? I think you could ask the same thing about the things that China is doing with regards to trying to influence U.S. policy on Taiwan, trying to influence Taiwan itself, trying to sort of establish new status quos around Taiwan and maybe the Philippines. Has there been an effect, right, on decision making and strategic outcomes based on China's use of cognitive warfare? I think that'd be great if someone were willing to take that on.
Yeah, that's dynamite. Yeah, for sure. We'll get that into the show notes and commend that to a student to check out further. And then lastly, Joe, you mentioned the unrestricted warfare paper that came out. I think that was in the late 1980s, actually. But
Yeah,
is there
it's post Desert Storm, I think.
Okay, yeah. All right, great. Maybe early mid 1990s. Any other book or online resource suggestion for an audience member?
Yeah, so Austin here. I think it's be very useful, and maybe we could push it out through IPA, through the links, and through this in the show notes. Is Dave Pitts and other colleagues that contribute to the Cipher Brief have written extensively on these issues. It helps frame gray zone and cognitive warfare in a very useful way, a very constructive way to help us orient our thinking, and it also helps us turn our heads to the issues we've been talking about for the last hour. And there's some other writings that we could also help you post that if folks thinking about not just how do we think about what's a challenge, but what do we do? What are the best considerations that we, as not only as a government, but as a community of folks who have shared interests, what can be done to improve our position to maneuver in this space together at the intersection of those shared interests?
Yeah, I'll give you three books that I think people should read, and they really are about how you question how you think. I'm a big fan of Nicholas Nassim Taleb. Both books, Anti-Fragile and Black Swan. Anti-Fragile is not about being resilient; it's about not breaking. And so, how do you think about that? And then the Black Swan, which those things that occur that were standing right in front of you, and how did you miss those? I would argue that's exactly what's happened to us right now, is that idea of the Black Swan. Like, we wake up, well, how'd that happen? What's been in front of us the whole time? And the last one I would recommend, and I think it's really a good one because it's a little bit more academic, but it is Thinking Fast and Slow by Kahneman and Tversky. It's type A, type B thinking, class 1, class 2 kind of thing stuff. And those three books, I think, will help you think about how you think. And I think thinking about how you think is the only way we're going to change the way we think, if that makes any sense. And those three books, I think, are really, really should be kind of mandatory if you want to change the way you're going to frame how you're looking at your environment.
And there's one other, Joe, that you and I talked about before we turn it over to Dave. Is the we understand that that the narrative space and understand the narrative, the storytelling part of this is critical to operating and maneuvering in the cognitive space. And learning from from the master storytellers in either the entertainment and the gaming industry, these industries who do this for a living globally, is critically important. And there's a host of incredible patriots who are part of that enterprise. And so I remember the screenwriting, all those
How to Write a Screenplay.
Yeah,
what a great book.
It's an awesome appreciation for the critical thought necessary, how to organize, to tell a story. And there are elements and nuggets within all of that would also help us understand how to conduct and gain advantage in cognitive maneuver, cognitive warfare.
Is
Dave?
so is the resource called How to Write a Screenplay? Is that what it is?
I'm going to look that up for you right now just to make sure. Yeah.
Okay.
And Dave,
Okay.
Dave, you may have some thoughts while
Yeah,
Joe picks that up.
that reminds me of something that I've been meaning to get somebody onto the podcast to discuss. There's something. Uh, it reminds me of another concept, and it's a really funny or funny sounding concept. It's something like it has something to do with like a dead cat or something like that, where there I know it doesn't relate at all to the concept, but I believe it has something to do with something dead cat. And what it is a highly structured way of storytelling and narrative within like movies and TV shows and maybe the lively arts in general. But it's
Yeah.
like, predictable, expectable tricks of how to go about telling a story that keeps the audience engaged and so on and so forth. I'll have to look it up and see if I can get it into the show notes, but it sounded similar to what you were just describing, Austin.
Yeah, this is called Screenplay, The Foundations of Screenwriting by Sid Field,
Okay.
SYD Field. And it gives you this idea of how you set it up, and it basically takes you through how, if you watch a movie, he tells you, watch this movie and then watch this. And it talks about how you actually do the plot points, bring people in,
Hmm.
reinforce it,
Hmm.
continue the narrative, do the closure. And it's a much better way to discuss how you're trying to convince somebody of coming into this world that you've created. And that's what you want to do when you start telling stories. And it's
Okay.
really, I read it and I was like, wow, this is really powerful if you think about what you want to do in the world.
And it helps
Right.
us
It
understand
it
some of the
it
fundamentals of maneuver in this
Yeah,
space.
Yeah,
absolutely.
so by somehow mimicking that kind of a choreographed uh, engagement, you can more easily bypass cognitive filters potentially.
Yeah, I think you're establishing. I would put it maybe another way. You're establishing a new filter for them. You,
Okay.
you're you're putting this together so it's a lens that they can go down this journey with,
Yeah.
right? And you can explain where you're going.
I'd recommend that Dave closes us out.
No, I was just listening, fascinating, and I don't even want to open a whole new line of discussion, but we were getting into storytelling there, right? And the
Yep.
power of storytelling, and I think when you do that, we talk about the power of narratives, and I think the most compelling narrative, or the foundational narrative, is your national narrative. I mean, China has one, and it tweaks it, of course, when it's dealing with Europe, then when it's dealing with the global South, so does Russia. And quite frankly, ours is in a little bit of trouble right now. And so, how do we carve out through good storytelling a national narrative, despite the difficulties with that advances our national security interests. We don't get to not have one, because if we don't write it, other people will. And if we don't tell the story, Russia and China will tell that story for us, which they're actively doing. So we have to sort of take this on. And I think maybe that's a great topic for some other discussion, this sort of the power and influence of storytelling, because that has been foundational to sort of this broad spectrum of cognition and influence for decades, right? That's kind of where it started. And it still plays a very critical role.
Yeah, I just one real quick point that Austin has been teaching me to, like, who are the best storytellers in the world? They're not us. They live in the entertainment industry and they live in the advertising industry. They're storytellers by profession.
Mm-hmm.
And they've been doing this for years. And they bring eyeballs and they bring thoughts. And how many people do you think about can talk about the movie they talked about? That was a great movie. I remember that from 15 years ago. That's a narrative. That's a hook. And that's the way we need to be thinking about how we're actually working in our for our future.
And how do we harness some of that for national security? And that's a delicate dance, and one that our government and our institutions and our military institutions, we ought to value it and knit that in to the way we do business as we move forward. And I'm very pleased to in my recent experience with some of our military senior leaders, there's an appreciation for that, and we just want to be very thoughtful of how we harness that and how we take advantage of that knowledge and that access and that the credibility of all those skills and capability globally. So John, thank you for this podcast opportunity. I know that this has probably spurred other conversations, other future podcasts or conversations, but for the community of interest that's going to dial in and listen to this, this is a call to action, but it's going to
Absolutely.
be a unified action, and one that's commonly oriented at the intersections of shared interests.
Yep, 100%. Thank you, gentlemen, for your time and for what you've done and what you are doing and will continue to be doing. And we certainly wish you all Godspeed on that journey. And with that, Austin Branch, Dave Pitts, and Joe Miller, thank you all for being guests on the Cognitive Crucible.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
The Cognitive Crucible is the only podcast dedicated to increasing interdisciplinary collaboration between information operations practitioners, scholars, and policymakers. To find out more about the Information Professionals Association, visit us at information-professionals.org. Please support our podcast by giving us a 5-star rating and leaving a review.